A lantern. Introduction. Cedartown sits beside a great highway which was once a buffalo trail. If you start in one direction on the highway and travel far enough, you will come to the effete east. If you start in the opposite direction and travel a few hundred miles farther, you will come to the distinctive west. Cedartown is neither effete nor distinctive, nor is it even particularly pleasing to the passing tourist. It's beautiful only in the eyes of those who live here and in the memories of the Nebraska-born whose dwelling in far places has given them moments of homesickness for the low-rolling hills, the swell and dip of the ripening wheat, the fields of sinuously waving corn, and the elusively fragrant odor of alfalfa. There are weeks when drifting snow and sullen sleet hold the Cedartown community in their bitter grasp. There are times when hot winds come out of the southwest and parch it with their feverish breath. There are periods of monotonous drought and periods of dreary rain. But between these onslaughts, there are days so perfect, so filled with clover odors and the rich pungent smell of newly turned loam, so sumac-laden and apple-burdened, that to the prairie-born there are no others as lovely by mountain, lake, or sea. The paved streets of Cedartown lie primly parallel over the obliterated tracks of the buffalo. The substantial buildings of Cedartown stand smartly over the dead ashes of Indian campfires. There are very few people left now in the community who have seen the transition, who have witnessed the westward trek of the last buffalo, the flicker of the last burnt-out ember. Old Abby Deal was one of these. Just outside the corporate limits of Cedartown stands the old Deal home. It was once a farmhouse, but the acreage around it has been sold, and Cedartown has grown out to meet it, so that a newcomer could not know where the town ceased and the country began. The house stands well back from the road in a big yard with a long double row of cedars connecting the formal parlor entrance and the small front gate. However, in the days when the Deals lived there, scarcely anyone used the little gate or walked up the grassy path between the cedars. All comers chose to enter by the wide carriage gate standing hospitably open and beckoning a welcome to the lane road which runs past a row of Lombardy poplars to the sitting room porch. The house itself is without distinction. There were no architects in the community when the first of its rooms were built. "We'll have the living room there and the kitchen here," one told A.Z. Drum. And old A.Z., with a few comments and much tobacco chewing, placed the living room there and the kitchen here. The result was weatherproof, sturdy, and artless. When the country was new, homes like dresses were constructed more for wearing qualities than beauty. Twice onto the first wing and L, old A.Z., a little more glum and tobacco-stained, added a room until the house had attained its present form. That form now is not unlike an aeroplane, which has settled down between the cedars at the front and the cottonwood windbreak in the rear. The parlor protruding toward the road might contain the engine. The sitting room to the left and the bedroom to the right seem like wings, while the dining room, kitchen, and a summer kitchen beyond trail out like the long tail of the thing. If one's imagination is keen, he can even fancy that the fan-shaped colored glass window in the parlor may someday begin to whirl propeller-like and the whole house rise up over the cedars. The interior of the house during Abby Deal's lifetime was a combination of old-fashioned things which she had accumulated through the years, and modern new ones which the grown children had given her. A dull-finished, beautifully proportioned radio cabinet stood opposite a homemade, rudely painted whatnot. A kitchen table with a little declivity in one corner, in which old Doc Matthews had rolled pills in the Civil War times, stood near a white enameled case which was the last word in refrigeration. A little crude oil painting of a prairie sunset which Abby Deal had done in the 70s hung across the room from a really exquisite study of the same subject, which a daughter, Mrs. Frederick Hamilton Baker, had done 40 years later. Abby Deal kept everything that ever came into the house, Every nail, every button, every string was carefully hoarded. "This would make a strong bottom for one of the kitchen chairs one day," old Abby Deal would say, when in truth the bottom of the chair was as strong as its legs. Or, "Save those stubs of candles from the Christmas tree. I can melt them and run them into one big one." The characteristic was a hangover from the lean and frugal days when the country was new, when every tiny thing had its use. As a consequence, there was in the house the flotsam of all the years. One of the daughters, Mrs. Harrison Scannell Rhodes, on her annual visit from Chicago, protested once, "Mother, if the house only represented some one period, but it's such a jumbled combination of things. They're not antique, they're just old." "And why should it?" Old Lady Deal flared up a little. "I'm no one period. I've lived with spinning wheels and telephones, with tallow dips and electric lights. I'm not antique. I'm just old. It represents me, doesn't it?" You will infer from the retort that old Abby Deal was a strong personality, and you would be quite right. The fact that she lived there in the old home until her 80th year over the protests of children and grandchildren attested to that. At the time she was 70, they began trying to pry her away from the Cedars. They talked over various plans for her, that she should go to Omaha to live with Mac, to Lincoln to live with Margaret, that she should have rooms at John's right there in Cedartown, that Grace should give up her teaching in Wesleyan University temporarily and stay at home. When they had quite definitely decided on the Lincoln home with Margaret, old Abby Deal spoke. "I will do nothing of the kind," she said with finality. "I'm going to stay right here, and kindly let me alone. Because a woman is old, has she no rights?" After that, they did not press the matter. They let her alone. But they drove in frequently, for only the Chicago daughter lived far away. Sometimes on Sundays, the Lane Road contained a half a dozen high-powered cars parked there through the dinner hour and the afternoon. But not one son or daughter could ever become reconciled to the idea of driving away and leaving her there. "When I think of fire," one of them would say, "or her getting sick in the night, or falling and no one to help her, or any one of a dozen things. Yes, something will happen to Mother some day." And they were quite right. Something happened to Mother. Last July, on a late afternoon, while suppers cooked and children of the north end of town played Run Sheep Run in her yard, old Lady Deal died. A neighbor woman found her lying across the foot of the bed, fully dressed, while the slice of meat in which she had been cooking burned to a crisp. Of the 5 middle-aged children, 7 grandchildren, and 3 great-grandchildren, not one was with her. They all came hastily in response to the messages. Within 2 hours' time, a shining limousine, 2 big sedans, and a roadster all stood in the Lane Road. For the first time, when the cars turned into the driveway by the Lombardy poplars, no little old white-haired woman with bright brown eyes had come hurrying out to give a cheery greeting. That queer, solemn hush of death hung over the whole house. It was in the quivering droop of the cottonwoods, in the deepening of the prairie twilight, in the silence of the star-filled summer sky. They all gathered in the parlor, with its modern radio and its old-fashioned whatnot, its elaborate new floor lamp and its crude oil painting. All of the children and several of the grandchildren were there. Mackenzie Deal, the Omaha banker, was there. John Deal, the Cedartown attorney and state legislator, was there. Mrs. Harrison Scannell Rhodes of Chicago, who had been visiting in Omaha, was there. Mrs. Frederick Hamilton Baker of Lincoln and Miss Grace Deal of Wesleyan University were there. They were people of poise, men and women not given to hysterical demonstration, but at the first gathering they all broke down. For a brief quarter of an hour, there in the old parlor with its familiar objects, they let their grief have sway. For a little while, there in the farm home of their youth, they were but children whose mother had left them lonely when the night was coming on. When they had pulled themselves together, their greatest grief seemed to be that she died alone. In deepest remorse they blamed themselves, standing there together in common sorrow. They said the same things over and over to each other. Didn't she seem as well as ever to you last week? I'll never forgive myself that I played bridge all afternoon. Do you suppose she suffered much? Or called for us? Isn't it dreadful? Poor mother. So many of us and not one of us here just when she needed us. And after all she's done for us. Only one, Laura Deal. A 12-year-old great-granddaughter turned away from the window where she had been looking down the long row of double-seaters and said in a clear, steady voice, "I don't think it was so dreadful. I think it was kind of nice. Maybe she didn't miss you." She slowly looked around the circle of her elders. "When you stop to think about it, maybe she didn't miss you at all. One time Grandma told me she was the very happiest when she was living over all her memories. Maybe," she hesitated, a little shy at expressing the thought in her heart, "maybe she was doing that then." This is the story of the old lady who died while the meat burned and the children played Run, Sheep, Run across her yard.